All right. Hello, everybody. I know your day was supposed to be over like 15 minutes ago, and now you still have another talk to listen to. So hopefully this will be useful and interesting to you, and I would really love to have more of a conversation, especially because there aren't that many of us in here. So if you feel like coming and sitting closer and asking questions during the presentation, that's fine too. Let's see. Okay, so as Vanessa mentioned, I've worn a few different hats. I actually started out as a special education teacher in New York City with kids with autism and intellectual disability. Ended up going back to grad school and getting my PhD in psychology, and I do research and clinical practice now. And so I do a lot of research with kids with 15Q. I also see a lot of your kiddos in the clinic at UCLA, and so wanted to come here today to just sort of talk about some of the things that I talk to families about in clinic a lot in terms of decision making about education and intervention planning. And it was great to hear the session on IEPs first, because that was really in depth about one part of the education planning. And then I'm going to do sort of a broader overview of all the different things that you might be thinking about and trying to make decisions about. Okay, so broadly, I think about this in terms of the categories of what happens at school, what happens at home, and then sort of add-ons that happen in the clinic. So we have talked a lot about IEPs now. At school, we want to think about the curriculum, what's actually being taught in the classroom, what type of classroom they're in. Their related services, so that's things like speech, OT. Some of you might have PT in schools, although for some reason that's a little harder to get. And then are there extracurricular activities that the child is involved in? Sometimes for our kids with more significant needs, they're actually, they're doing maybe recreation therapy, or they have a social interaction or play group during lunch. And then at home, the common things that we see are behavioral therapy. We're going to talk about all these more in depth. Behavioral therapy, and then hopefully you all have respite services. If you don't, please complain to someone. I know how the process works in California. It's different in every state, but you should be getting some respite services we'll talk more about those providers. And then for most of your kids, they're also going to be doing some sort of clinic-based services. They might have additional speech therapy, occupational therapy, PT that are not in school, that are happening outside at a clinic. They might be in a social skills group or a play group. And so the first question that families have a lot is, how on earth do I prioritize all of these things? Because you can't be doing all of those things every day, and they all seem very, very important. So how do you figure out how your child is going to spend their time? And the first thing that I want everyone to recognize is that you are not going to make or break your child's future depending on whether you decide to sign up for an extra hour of clinic speech therapy. It feels very important. Every one of those decisions you make feels so important. But you need to remember that there's a whole picture going on, and each one of those tiny decisions adds up to the whole picture, and the whole picture is very important. But all of those incremental decisions, don't agonize over them. You need to think about what matches your child's needs, what are your goals for your child, and that can be based on your child and your family. You have to take into account your family's needs as well. You might have other kids. Do you have time to drive to that extra speech therapy session? Or is it really taking away from your overall family life? That is a completely valid and important thing to take into consideration when you're making these decisions. What's feasible? If your kiddo is exhausted, they're probably not benefiting from that extra hour of ABA at the end of the day. You know, so what is really feasible in your life and your child's life? And then where are you seeing progress? If the child is making great progress in speech therapy and they're really not making a lot of progress in OT, that's something we want to take into consideration. Do we think that they could make more progress in OT if we add an hour there? Or do we feel like maybe that is really a challenging area for them? Maybe they're not going to learn to tie their shoes. Maybe that's okay, and we want to capitalize on the progress that's happening in speech and add an extra hour over there instead. Those sorts of decisions are what you're going to have to think about, because you just can't do everything. Also, keep in mind that skills can be targeted in lots and lots of ways, especially for our kids with more significant needs who need a lot of time and practice to develop a new skill. Just because we want them to get better at using their AAC device doesn't necessarily mean that we want to add extra speech therapy hours. It might be that we want to add a goal for ABA to work on the device. Right, so be creative about how you're using your child's time in therapy, because for our kids, a lot of their skills, they're going to be working on that same skill in lots of different contexts. Okay, so one of the big decisions that we have to make is where the child is going to go to school, what school they're going to be at, and what type of classroom that they're going to be in. And again, this is an area where there is no right or wrong answer. There are pros and cons to all of these things, and we just need to think about what fits best in the situation. So, not as relevant for this population, but sometimes a child with a disability might be in a general education class with no extra supports, they're doing fine. Then we might have a child who's in a general education class, but they do have some support. So maybe there's an aide with them for part of the day. Maybe they are getting some curriculum modifications. And those are typically what people mean when they say the word inclusion. These words are all a little bit fuzzy. It depends on how people use them. But the word inclusion usually means you're in the general education class. And then as we move down the spectrum, we have things like resource support. You might hear this referred to as resource room, pull-out services. And this means that a child's home is in the general education classroom. That's the class that they belong to, their class of record. But for a certain period of the day, they leave and go usually into a special education classroom to get some extra help. If we flip it around the other way, we get to the self-contained special education class, where their home is in the special education class, and that could be that they're in that classroom all day, or that might be their home-based classroom, but they leave and go into the general education class for part of the day. And those options are what people refer to a lot as mainstreaming. So you sort of belong to the special ed class, but you mainstream out into the general ed class for a portion of the day. And then we get down to what you and I probably think of more literally as special education. So we have our self-contained special ed class. We might have a child who's in an entire special education school. Depending on how large your school district is, the public school district might have standalone special education schools. When I was a teacher in New York City, I taught at a public New York City school, but it was fully kids with autism and intellectual disability in the school. If you're in a smaller area, the school district does not typically have those completely separate programs, and this is where we see things like non-public schools, which is another option for a fully special education program. And then things that we rarely get to, but for kids with really significant needs, sometimes they go to a residential program where they're no longer living at home because for a variety of reasons, it's too difficult to care for them there. And then for kids who are very medically ill, they may be in a home or hospital program. And this is the continuum of special education. And you'll see a page in your IEP that talks about the least restrictive environment. And that terminology comes from our special education laws that say we can't just dump a kiddo into, for example, a residential placement without having a good justification for why these other environments wouldn't work. So what is supposed to happen is that you and the IEP team sit down and think about this entire list Is the child a good fit for general ed? No? Okay. Are they a good fit for a special education classroom with mainstreaming? No? Okay. Are they a good fit for a special education school? And it's supposed to go stepwise so that if you end up in this what's considered a more restrictive placement, it's because everyone is in agreement that these other placements are not appropriate. And they can be not appropriate for a variety of reasons. If you are a parent who prefers to have your child in a self-contained special education classroom, there is nothing wrong with that. There's a lot of, pro-inclusion and reasons to think about wanting a child in an inclusion environment. But I've worked with a lot of parents who say, my kid is really impaired. He has seizures 15 times a day. He's 10 years old and still in diapers, and I don't see the purpose of letting him sit in the back of a general ed classroom. I would rather that he be in a special ed classroom that I think is a good fit for him. And sometimes if you're reading the message boards, there's a message out there that you should be advocating for your child to be in inclusion. That's not the right placement for everyone, and it is okay if that's not the placement that you think is the best fit. But if you do think that it is the best fit, regardless of where your child's needs are at, that is something you can also advocate for. So this is the first area that you have to decide on, and there is no right answer. Sometimes a family feels really strongly that inclusion is just morally what they prefer. They feel like, I want my child in the general education class with their typically developing peers. And we have to sort of strategize about, okay, who is that teacher going to be and what are their personal feelings about having a child with special needs in their class? We need to make sure that the teacher is a good fit. We need to talk to the special ed administrator and make sure that this child gets placed in a classroom that is going to be welcoming and appropriate for them. So there's a lot of little pieces to figure out, even though on paper it should be very straightforward. Someone asked a question about standardized tests earlier. Typically, there are 3 options for standardized tests, unless you find a way to get out of them entirely, but typically it has to be in there. So accommodations is not something for our population that's usually relevant, but these are things where the actual content of the test isn't changed, but the child might, for example, get extended time on tests. We see these sorts of accommodations for kids with attention issues, things like that a lot. Modifications are things that actually alter what is being tested, but without taking it totally out of grade level. So they might be doing the grade level 5th grade test, but for example, they're allowed to use a calculator. So now they're no longer required to do the mental math, but they're still taking that same assessment. And then alternate assessment is what most of our kiddos are going to be doing. In California, this is called CAPA, the California Alternate Performance Assessment. Every state has a different version. Some states use portfolios. And this is where everyone is in agreement that the child is not working on a grade level curriculum. They're not working on a modified grade level curriculum. They are working on their own curriculum based on their needs. And then because there are legal requirements that schools perform standardized assessments, they have to have an alternate assessment for those kids. But as the last presenter talked about, when I was a teacher, I did not place a huge priority on these tests. I knew that the parents didn't place a huge priority on them, so it isn't something that we really spent a lot of time focusing on. It didn't detract from the IEP goals. It's totally fine to express to your child's teacher, if you don't care about these assessments, that it's sure the child has to, sit down and do the task when it happens. But if it's not something you want to focus on during the year, that's totally fine. Just know that it's going to be in the IEP which one of these options it is. You guys got tons of information about IEP, so I'm not going to talk about this much. I just wanted to make a couple small points. For our kiddos with more significant needs, it is true that more is not always better, but we sometimes see the opposite for our kids, where I might see an 8-year-old in clinic and I ask the family to bring their IEP in with them, and it has 3 goals on it. You can't convince me, no matter how significant a child's needs are, you can't convince me that 3 goals takes up their entire day every day. So we want a balance. Sure, we don't want 50 goals, but we want enough goals that it makes sense that this is actually filling up their time. Because for our kids, particularly who are on alternate assessment, they're not following the grade level curriculum, right? So the goals that are in the IEP are it. That's their whole educational program. So we want to make sure that there are goals that are feasible and realistic and manageable and all of that, but we also want to see enough goals that if I, as a substitute teacher, came into the classroom and grabbed your kiddo's IEP, I could think of what to do with them. If we have a kid whose IEP goal is, toilet training and responding to their name and sorting blocks by color, that's great, but what are you going to do after the first 10 minutes of the day? Because you've kind of run out of things to do. So there should be enough that it makes sense to you how your child is spending their time. A note about related services, which also came up. This happens all the time, in particular with physical therapy. It is important to have your terminology right, and this already got brought up. For the school district, their responsibility is to provide services that are required for a free and appropriate public education, that term that I'm sure you've heard. Meaning that the service needs to be necessary for the child to access the school environment, to be involved, to make progress at school. It's not enough just to say that a child would benefit from a service. There are a lot of kids who, for example, would benefit from additional academic tutoring. But they're not getting that because schools are not in the business of offering the best. They're in the business of offering something that is relatively equitable and fair for everyone, at least on paper. So if you're trying to keep PT in the IEP, or you're trying to increase the hours of speech therapy, you cannot show up to the IEP meeting and say, but my kid still isn't doing X, Y, and Z, he needs more therapy. You have to come in with concrete examples of, my kid can't navigate this play structure, he needs physical therapy. My kid can't hang their backpack up, he needs more OT. You have to tie it to specific things that are happening at school in order to really demonstrate the need for that. Okay, and then in terms of clinic and home-based services, the landscape here has changed a little bit depending on if kids have an autism diagnosis or not, which I'll talk about in a minute. So these services can either be insurance-based, covered by your child's medical insurance, or they may be state-funded through whatever agency your state has that administers Department of Health and Human Services requirements. So in California, that's called Regional Center. Every state has their own publicly funded department that handles that. I apologize for those of you who are international. I have no idea what your requirements are. But here, you are accessing these services through insurance, through your equivalent of regional center, your state-funded agency, or a lot of families end up self-paying for things that they can't get covered but feel like are important. As I mentioned, an autism diagnosis these days can make a difference because a lot of states have insurance mandates that require insurance to cover behavioral services for autism that are not necessarily covered for kids with intellectual disability. It is wildly unfair and stupid. That's the reality right now. The majority of kids with a DUP 15Q do meet diagnostic criteria for autism. So if your child does not have an autism diagnosis and you are having trouble getting services covered, I would recommend probably start with the pediatrician and ask about getting an autism diagnosis on paper if in fact they do meet that criteria. Because just with our particular landscape right now, the autism folks have done a great job of advocating for increased funding and services. It hasn't happened in the intellectual disability community in the same way. So you guys can take advantage of that by making sure your kiddo's autism characteristics are documented as a diagnosis, which may help you with insurance reimbursement. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit now about behavior therapy. For our kids, this is typically the large portion of their therapy that happens outside of school. How many of your kids are doing some sort of home ABA or behavior therapy? Okay, so most of the group, that's good. So behavior therapy, most of it falls under the umbrella of ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis. And then we can really think of these different modes of therapies as being on a continuum from very adult-led directive to something that's very child-led. Floor time is not ABA, and I'll talk about what these different things are in a minute. But we want to think about the different pros and cons of these different therapy styles, and make sure that you are advocating with your behavior agencies for the style of therapy that you think is going to be a good fit for your kid and their goals. So ABA is this umbrella term for most types of treatments used for ASD, and then by extension for kids with Dup15q. And it's really based on the idea that we can shape and reinforce new behaviors and reduce undesirable behaviors. And ABA is focused on improving all domains of functioning. It does, despite the name, ABA is appropriate for many, many more things than just challenging behavior. So some parents have said to me, well, my kid doesn't have challenging behaviors, so we never did ABA. And that's a misunderstanding. ABA is just a style of teaching and learning that can be used to teach all sorts of different skills. It is particularly useful for a child who has challenging behaviors, but it's also very useful for teaching daily living skills, pre-academics, functional life skills, all of that sort of stuff. Floor time is not under the ABA umbrella. How many of you have heard of floor time? Do any of you do floor time as a therapy? So it depends on where you are in the country. Floor time is particularly popular in parts of Southern California. It is based on the idea that you can build a relationship with the child and then follow in with what the child is interested in order to build up new abilities. It does not have the same sort of research support that ABA does. Floor time sometimes feels a lot better to families because there's not a lot of direction or instruction being given to the child, and it's much more of a relaxed play interaction. But on the flip side, because it's a much more relaxed play interaction, sometimes the child isn't actually being pushed to practice new skills or do things that are less comfortable to them. So I'm not in the business of endorsing one treatment over another, but I will say that if you're interested in pursuing floor time, make sure you're keeping track of whether or not you feel like your child is really making progress and gains. And that really just depends a lot on the therapist. It's not that there's anything inherently wrong with floor time, just that it can quickly become just a relaxed play session that doesn't go anywhere unless a therapist is really making sure to move it forward. All right, so discrete trial training, DTT, which was developed by Lovaas at UCLA several decades ago, is what people often think of when they hear the word ABA. This is the most structured, adult-led directive version. It's usually in a very controlled environment. The kiddo might be sitting at a table, and this is where you have the therapist asking the child to do something over and over and over again, giving them reinforcement every time they do it correctly, giving them a correction every time they do it incorrectly. And in recent years, the ABA field has moved a lot more towards what we call naturalistic developmental behavioral interventions, because we like long names, where we're taking these same ABA strategies, but trying to place them within a more developmentally appropriate naturalistic context. So the most popular that you may have heard of is called PRT, Pivotal Response Therapy, which was developed by Bob and Linda Cagle at UC Santa Barbara. And this is much more play-based. It's intended to be initiated by the child and their interests. The goal is to target what the Kegels considered pivotal areas of development, such as motivation, self-management. And it uses a combination of naturalistic and developmental strategies. So a lot of ABA agencies these days will say that they do PRT or that their therapists are PRT trained. It's sort of the most commonly deployed naturalistic version out there. At UCLA, we do something called JASPER, Joint Attention, Symbolic Play, Engagement, and Regulation, which is not as much out in the world yet because we haven't published a manual, but it'll be coming out. But it's very similar to PRT. It's slightly more child-led and targets some different skills. But again, the idea is it should be a session that is relatively comfortable for the child. There shouldn't be a ton of sitting at a table and throwing a tantrum that we have to work through. It happens sometimes. But there should be some more fun, some more positive affect from the child. But at the same time, the therapist should have some really specific skills that they're targeting in the context of those sessions. In general, a more structured DTT type context can be really helpful for establishing new skills. Right, so if we really want our child to learn to identify different colors, sitting down at a table and practicing that skill in a structured way over and over and over again can be a really good way to start. So there's nothing wrong with having DTT as part of the program. But research has shown us that more naturalistic styles like PRT, like JASPER, like the Early Start Denver model, are more helpful for generalizing those skills and making sure that the child can do them in other contexts and that they're really moving out to the rest of that child's life. So if we want to make sure that they can take that knowledge of different colors and apply it to, you know, which apple do you want, the red one or the green one, doing a more naturalistic developmental intervention is going to help us get there. So with everything else, there's, there's room for everything, and the goal here is to find the balance that works the best for your family's values, your child's learning style, where they're at, what skills they need to learn, and these things are going to move and change over time. So, you may hit a point where you feel like, okay, we're kind of done with these tabletop activities. I want them to be doing more naturalistic things. And then you may hit another point where you feel like, wow, we really are not making a lot of progress. Their behavior has gotten really dysregulated. Maybe we want to go back to doing some more structured intervention. It's fine to keep moving back and forth and evaluating as you're going. It doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. It just means that, like everyone else, our kids change and develop over time, and so their needs change as well. Speaking of measuring progress, progress should be tracked using some sort of objective measures. Our kids are not great at taking standardized assessments, so they don't need to be that objective, but there should be some sort of metric that multiple people can look at and see the same thing. We want to be tracking that progress on a regular basis because we don't want to waste our kids' time. We want to know if something isn't working so that we can change it. Again, it doesn't mean anyone necessarily did anything wrong or made the wrong decision. It just means that, everything is always going to be a work in progress, and we want to be aware of how things are going so that we can modify. If your child is not making any progress towards their goals, then something needs to change. It might be that the goals are too hard, that we started with too much at once, and we need to break it down into smaller pieces. It might be that the goal is too easy and the kiddo is bored and does not particularly care about pointing to the blue card anymore because they're over it, and that's why they're not doing it. It might be that we're using a teaching strategy that isn't a good match for the child, for the skill. We may need to change how we're teaching it. And then we may sometimes decide that a goal is simply not a priority. Like the example earlier of a kiddo who was stuck for years trying to write their name, and eventually they decided, you know what, this is not a good use of anyone's time, let's go ahead and move on. There's nothing wrong with that. It's not that your child failed to learn a skill. It's that we're getting to know the child better and their needs better, and now we're recognizing that that wasn't a great skill to have picked in the first place. And you can sometimes circle back to it again in the future if you decide that it's going to be important. But there's no shame in deciding to throw a goal in the trash and move on to something new if it just isn't working for your child at that point. For our kids with more significant needs, we also want to make sure we don't get super stuck on prerequisite skills, right? Because for our kids, it can take them a really long time to learn something new. And if we spend forever and ever and ever saying that we want them to be able to identify all of the letters of the alphabet before we move on to sight words, they might never do that. We may never get to sight words if we stay stuck on the letters of the alphabet forever. So sometimes we might say, okay, let's go ahead and try sight words instead and see what happens. For some kids, it's a lot more meaningful than trying to recognize an F by itself. If instead you're trying to recognize the word frog and know that it matches up with your favorite frog toy, that might be a little bit more motivating and interesting. So just because something happens in a certain order in typical development does not mean that that's how our kids are going to learn it. So don't get totally hung up on prerequisites. As I mentioned about standardized assessments, people will use standardized assessments with your kids over the years. We use them in research, we use them in the clinic, your school district will use them. Be aware that for our population of kids, their standard scores, the way the assessment is supposed to be scored, those standard scores are likely going to stay flat or go down over time, even though the child is gaining skills. Just be prepared for that. I've explained this to a lot of families in clinic, and it really makes me upset that no one has explained it before. The standard score is telling you where the child is at in reference to their chronological, age-matched, typically developing peers. So for our kids who are slower in their development, that gap is going to get wider as it goes over time, right? So when they're 2, they may be similar to a 1-year-old, in which case they're about half of where they should be. By the time they're 10, they may be something like a 3-year-old, and now that standard score is going to have gone down because they've gotten further away from the typical development curve. Does that make sense? So be prepared for seeing those numbers. It doesn't mean that your child has lost skills. They're probably gaining skills. It just means that the way our assessments measure them is showing us that the slope of their development is different. So I have an example here. This is from a kiddo with Dupe 15 who we evaluated when he was 3.5 and then again when he was about 5.5. We used the same assessment both times. So his standard scores and percentiles haven't changed at all because he's at the floor of the assessment, meaning basically that the scale doesn't go down that far to show us what exactly he's doing. So those haven't changed whatsoever. But if we look instead at the age equivalents, which tell us where the child's at developmentally, we can see that, for example, his receptive language, when he was 3.5 years old, was at the age equivalent of a 9-month-old, which means he was really not showing us that he understood any language. And then when we assessed him again 2 years later, his receptive language was at a 15-month-old level, which means he was able to demonstrate understanding of quite a few basic words, recognized his name, yes, no, things like that. So that's quite a lot of meaningful growth, but we don't see that in the standard scores. We have to be a little more creative about how we look at the assessment results. So it shouldn't be your job to interpret those things, but it seems that some of you get assessment reports without having this explained to you, so I wanted to make sure we had the chance to go over it.